Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Clone Wars might have been an artificially orchestrated conflict, but the fighting done by the clones and droids was quite real and deadly. And the Republic military, naval forces, and ground forces would learn from their experiences, and that would go on to shape the formation of the Imperial military. For instance, until the late stages of the Clone Wars, the Galactic Republic Navy was constantly changing up their starfighter doctrine. Today, I want to take a look at a very specific starfighter we've seen quite a lot in the Bad Batch. It's the Alpha-3 Nimbus-class V-wing. This is one of the lesser-known starfighters used by both the late Galactic Republic and early Galactic Empire. In many ways, the adoption of the V-wing demonstrates the natural progression from the Republic's more robust starfighter doctrine to the Empire's more heavy reliance on ships of the line. In the outside of the war, the Republic Starfighter Corps was essentially the entire Republic Navy. After discovering the droid army on Geonosis, the Republic essentially had to piece together a strike force. They had hundreds of thousands of highly trained and skilled clone troopers already structured into two-sector armies. The Kaminoans even contracted Quad Drive Yards and its many subsidiaries to design a set of vehicles that all worked in tandem to give the average infantry squad more mobility. The LAAT, ATTE, and ATRT package would be one of the main reasons why the clones were so effective even when they were outnumbered 10-1, as was the case on Geonosis. Those three vehicles give you mobility, access to vertical space, and also a lot of speed. The Kaminoans even arranged for the construction of the Acclimator-class assault ship, which was just a military transport, with a massive ramp terrific for offloading and loading massive amounts of manpower and supplies. Although the ship was armed and armored and shielded, it was relatively to take out, especially when it was in the last stages of its descent into a planet, especially when they were at the last stages of their descent in atmosphere. Yes, it's impressive that these massive ships can even fly in atmosphere, but therein lies the weakness. They can barely fly in atmosphere. And so at the time, the Republic Navy basically consisted of whatever the Jedi had, and a handful of diplomatic vessels and consular vessels. Most of them were unarmed, and the few that were armed for peacekeeping missions, and not a brutal assault onto a fortress world at the heart of your enemy's industrial might. And so at Geonosis, in order to kind of pave the way for the invasion force, the Republic had to rely on the Delta 7 Ether Sprite Jedi Starfighter and a prototype version of the V-19 Torrent Starfighter, which would become a lot more popular after this one battle. Luckily, the majority of the Separatist fleet attempted to escape Geonosis when the Republic fleet arrived. I guess those acclimators looked a lot scarier than they actually were, and all 12 of them end up making it onto the ground without much harassment, which is a big deal because they carried a lot of troops. You really can't afford for one of these things to go down. Now, after Geonosis, the Republic Navy would scramble to find as many different models and types of starfighters to try out for their starfighter corps. The V-19 Torrent would become the main space superiority fighter utilized by the Republic Navy. Designed and manufactured by Slane & Corporal, a firm that was known for very exotic and deadly designs. The V-19 had both lasers and an ordnance launcher, but the fighter lacked shields, and the first variant actually required an external hyperdrive ring, but the second variant did not. More importantly, the V-19 was nimble and quick and decently armored for a ship of its size. And I think the Republic made a good choice going specifically with Slane & Corporal. I mean, the galaxy was at peace for 1,000 years. A lot of your more traditional manufacturers were basically driven by a lack of demand for very, very aggressive military-style ships, and also there were regulations against certain types of ships, usually focused on capital ships, but I'm pretty sure there were probably some limits to starfighters as well. And so the only species who still knew how to make proper ships were either your larger firms like Quad Systems Engineering or certain species like the Mandalorians, who were always preparing for war and conflict. And Slane & Corporal, well, they were a lot more like the Mandalorians. They have a very warrior-like mentality. The Verpine were a very aggressive and innovative hive-based species that created all sorts of advanced weapons technology, all designed to kill. The 1,000 years of peace didn't really affect the Verpine's designs, unlike other manufacturers who were just pumping out, peacetime designs, which were, well, like peacetime designs. Take a look at the classic Spitfire. This beautiful bird would serve the Royal Air Force quite well throughout World War II, and it was crucial in winning the battle over Britain. To the untrained eye, the Spitfire basically looks the same throughout the war, but there are actually dozens of upgrades throughout the war to the Spitfire. For instance, the Spitfire Mark I debuted in 1938, and by 1945 they were on Mark 24 already. The Mark 24 was twice as heavy as the Mark I and had almost twice the horsepower and had a completely different flight characteristics. They also changed the control surfaces. Even the famous elliptical wing design was changed And the Browning machine guns were eventually replaced and upgraded to 20mm cannons. Then you had the pre-war design of the extremely underrated Hawker Hurricane. Its Mark I variant had fabric-covered wings and a wooden propeller. And it still didn't stop the Hurricane from getting more than half of the confirmed kills during the Battle of Britain. Although later variants did have, like metal skin over the wings. We see the same thing happen with pre-war designs in the Clone Wars. In a lot of ways, the Delta 7 Ether Sprite, which the Republic relied on so much in those early days leading up to the war, represented your typical peacetime design. It was never properly tested in wide-scale battles, where debris and stray laser fire streaks through the sky. Add in the Jedi's pacifist views on using deadly force, and you have a very beautiful, very nimble starfighter which just lacks firepower and defensive measures. The Delta 7 was really just a work of art, and it even lacked many sensors and aids that normal pilots used because the Jedi liked flying through the Force. Now, this was a luxury that the Jedi enjoyed before the war properly started, but it became a quick liability as well once the war began. I mean, the Delta 7 Ether Sprite had to be switched out pretty quickly because they were losing so many Jedi in this thing. In a lot of ways, flying that Delta 7 was like driving a manual transmission. It's fun, and at one time it was probably better than most automatic transmissions, but nowadays you have like paddle shifters, Tiptronic, DCT. The V-19 being far more practical than the Delta 7 would eventually become the... And so it's not surprising that the V-19 being far more practical than the Delta 7 would eventually be the workhorse for the early Republic Navy, and it would be joined by Incom's Z-95 Headhunter, and also Corsair Manufacturing's Y-wing. Now, if you take a look at the V-19 Torrent starfighter, it is a bit smaller than your typical space superiority fighter. But if you take a look at the type of enemies the V-19 went up against, it was actually pretty bulky, especially compared to all of the droid fighters. Droid fighters? Foo fighters that the Separatists used. And that's because the Separatist Navy relied on swarms of extremely short range and short flight time droid fighters like the Vulture droid. And these are super cheap, basically expendable defensive assets. Because droid fighters didn't have a living pilot, you could save a lot of space and weight. You can remove the cockpit, all of the controls, the life support systems, and the armor around the pilot. This made the Vulture droid far smaller than any manned fighter, and is also extremely nimble. While the V-19 Torrent starfighter did a good job against the Vulture droids, it lacked the punch you'd want in a true multi-purpose starfighter. There's always a trade-off between running several different models of fighters in your Navy with niche roles and abilities, and just having one standard fighter who can do everything for your Navy. I mean, the latter usually happens when a military is either resource limited or trying to just decrease the costs of their military force. And we're not just talking about the construction costs, but also the maintenance. And this is usually achieved by just scaling up production. It's the economy of scale. For a while, the Galactic Republic faced threats of all different kinds from different directions and relied on a patchwork of starfighters. But in the long term, there were definitely a lot of voices calling for a standardization and consolidation of the starfighter corps. The closest thing the early Republic had to a multi-purpose starfighter that actually could perform the role required of it was the Incom Z-95 Headhunter. But it was built and designed many decades before the war even started, and without substantial upgrades, it just wasn't up to the task it was given. Now, eventually, a new, larger starfighter came out of Incom Corporation, the ARC-170. This was designed as a long-range scouting vessel. It was a large vessel at 12 meters long, almost twice as long as the V-19 and Vulture droid. It also had a crew of 3 to sustain it on those longer missions. Equipped with medium cannons, which were quite heavy for a small craft, a very powerful engine, hyperdrive and deflector shields, and a very advanced sensor suite, Republic strategists loved the flexibility that this starship could give to them. And a lot of you guys are probably pointing out that the ARC-170 shares a lot of similarities with the Incom X-Wing that would replace it and give the Rebellion a similar advantage over the Empire when they used it. But here's the problem. The Republic's leaders were looking for that multi-purpose starfighter, and they decided to try out the ARC-170 in that role. As we mentioned before, Palpatine was leading the Republic in one direction, a military-first political order. And as the war carried on, there were desperate attempts to make the military more efficient, low-cost, and deadlier. If the ARC-170 could prove that it was not only a reconnaissance craft but also a mainline fighter, this could be the future of the Republic Navy. At first, the ARC-170 proved to be a very useful starfighter, especially on missions where you don't have a Venator carrier with your task force. The ARC-170 was also a perfect escort for the Y-wing, which was also hyperdrive equipped. But then the Battle of Coruscant happened. It was a stunning sneak attack into the heart of the Republic by Count Dooku's forces. The Republic, up until this point, had all of the Separatist forces bottled up in the Outer Rim sieges, and so no one was really prepared when a giant fleet of Separatist warships appeared over Coruscant. During the battle, several squadrons of ARC-170 starfighters, along with the V-19 Torrent starfighter and the newly introduced Alpha-3 Nimbus-class V-wing starfighter, were deployed in defense of the planet. By the end of the battle, the new V-wing and the V-19 Torrent starfighter did a pretty decent job. The ARC-170 was devastated. The larger size of the vessel, the slower turning radius, even the slower cycling rate of the medium cannons on the vessel just made the ARC-170 a pretty terrible dogfighter, especially going up against those nimble Vulture droids. Also, the Separatists at one point in the war rolled out the Tri-Droid Fighter, an even smaller and more deadly automated starfighter. It would basically put an end to the ARC-170's future here on Coruscant. I mean, the performance of the ARC-170 at the Battle of Coruscant was so poor that it would go on to convince Palpatine that the future of his Navy will depend on small, nimble, cheap interceptors like the V-19 and the V-wing, instead of using something. This would eventually lead to the design of the TIE Fighter, the ultimate mass-produced short-range interceptor. But before that happened, in the last years of the Clone Wars and in the early years of the Galactic Empire, you had this, the Alpha-3 Nimbus-class V-wing. It almost looks like an A-wing and a TIE fighter got together and made a baby. Now, based on the wedge shape of the hull, it shouldn't surprise you that the Alpha-3 was designed by Quad Systems Engineering. The Alpha-3 V-wing wasn't really a huge improvement on the V-19 Torrent. As a matter of fact, the older starfighter had some advantages. For instance, the second variant, as we mentioned, had a built-in hyperdrive. The V-wing did not. The V-19 also had a munitions launcher for tackling larger vessels. The V-wing did not. The V-wing also didn't have shields, a life support system, and wasn't that much faster or more maneuverable than the V-19. Its main advantages were the rapid-fire laser cannons it had, very reminiscent of the weapon systems that would be used on the TIE fighters that would follow. The V-wing would also use a version of the twin-ion engine, one of the most efficiently designed engines in Star Wars history. This is really the main reason why the V-19 and all other starfighters were sort of phased out towards the end of the Clone Wars. Palpatine really wanted his next generation fighters to use the twin-ion engine, one of the most efficient engines ever designed. What's even more impressive is that this engine has 0 moving parts. That significantly increases the reliability of this vessel and lowers maintenance costs and work. And because the V-19 was created by the Verpine, it had a lot of different alien species working there, and that's not something that the Empire was really comfortable. They didn't want their state-of-the-art starfighter being designed by what they saw as enemies of the state. Quad Systems Engineering and its parent company, Quad Drive Yards, already supplied most of the Galactic Republic Navy. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, the V-wing had been phased out for the TIE Fighter. It had served as the main interceptor for the Imperial fleet for more than a decade. In a lot of ways, the V-wing was really a stopgap measure used by Emperor Palpatine to basically hold over his forces until the TIE Fighter program was properly designed and ready for launch. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.